So obviously, if you've been watching the news this weekend, you know that Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban. It is back to square one over there, or maybe square minus 500, because it's been returned to the Middle Ages. And basically, this would be probably the capstone story of a generation. A lot of us grew up in the shadow of 9/11. In 2001, of course, there was the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon that changed all of our lives. Most of us had never known the U.S. to be involved in any conflict, whether a world conflict or some foreign intervention up until then. Obviously, there were some small exceptions like Bosnia and Somalia, and the U.S. certainly had very short interventions. I remember there was the Haiti intervention of 94, if I'm not mistaken. But Afghanistan and the 9/11 attacks that preceded it, they were an introduction to a new era of American life for people who grew up in the 90s, meaning that we were no longer a country that was living in a, at least for civilians, we were living basically in a peaceful and almost autopilot mode where what really mattered was what was being represented by pop culture and TV. Instead, now, a lot of America's course would be guided by its fortunes in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think that was a major turning point in a negative direction. At the time, we didn't know that. But now, I'm saying those of us that grew up, the younger people, I think people who were in power were probably aware of the risk that they were taking and didn't care. And I think that President Biden certainly bears plenty of blame for that, as did President Bush and President Obama after him. And it's really a sad situation. So there's already comparisons being made to the fall of Saigon in 1975. This is actually going to go in the latest edition of the newsletter. I'm going to kind of pair this video with it. So I would say that the comparisons are a little bit inappropriate. And I say a little bit because I think this is worse. Let me explain a few reasons why what happened today, probably, if you look at it objectively, is much worse than what happened in 1975 with the fall of Saigon to the North Vietnamese. The first reason is that we were deliberately trying to get out of the Vietnam War for several years because it became obvious that if the U.S. continued to invest more personnel there and more equipment, the Vietnamese government would never become self-sustaining. So the U.S., in order to facilitate an independent country there, they started to do something called Vietnamization. That's what President Nixon did. He said that the overcommitment of U.S. troops made the involvement in Vietnam counterproductive. The U.S. would end up being basically a colonial power there. And he started to say, look, we're going to focus much more on upgrading the capabilities of the South Vietnamese forces and prepare them to fight the communist Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese without American help or the help of some of the other countries that were involved in the war. People are not aware that certain countries like Australia and the Philippines were also involved in Vietnam. Also, by the way, in Afghanistan. So this was largely a successful effort if you look at it in strictly military terms. The U.S. was able to get the South Vietnamese to a capability where the U.S. was able to sign the peace accords, the Paris Peace Accords, with North Vietnam and basically get an orderly transition of U.S. combat forces out of Vietnam, ending the U.S. role in the conflict. What happened in Saigon in 1975 happened about a year and a half later, and while it was certainly tragic, while the U.S. does bear some responsibility for allowing the situation to get out of hand, it wasn't such a rapid deterioration. And in fact, you could say that it was more a result of the flaws of the agreement with North Vietnam and the post-Nixon situation in the United States, where many people were simply saying, if there's a conflict in Southeast Asia, we're not going to get involved. We have the oil crisis. We have all these other concerns that are going on here. We can't afford to go back to Vietnam. So there was no public will to get involved again once the North Vietnamese violated the Paris Peace Accords in early 1970, or I think it was late 1974, and invaded South Vietnam again and eventually pushed through and conquered the country. So it was a much more gradual defeat. It's also something that if the Nixon administration's protocols had been followed, maybe it wouldn't have happened. Now, there's no guarantee. The U.S. cannot be the guarantor for the independence of another country. Every country is responsible for its own independence. But if you look at the performance of the South Vietnamese army in 1975, they did fight very doggedly to keep the communists from taking over their country. That's not what happened in Afghanistan. The Afghan security forces folded like a cheap suit. It was embarrassing, and I think it should be a source of embarrassment for every American to see that this is the result of 20 years of investment in a country that's supposedly an ally and sort of a country that we've stewarded through all of these years of development, and it's all gone within a matter of months and weeks. One of the other reasons that I think it's worse than South Vietnam, also worse than the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, is that in both Vietnam and the Soviet withdrawal, there was an orderly withdrawal of troops, and the last soldier left the country with the authority intact that they were leaving. So the U.S. left South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government was in place. So we had who we were turning it over to in a more orderly fashion. The Soviets left Afghanistan. What people forget about Soviet Afghanistan is that the government over there, it's called the PDPA, they lasted another 2 years. It doesn't really make sense if you think about it, because they were so unpopular, and there was so little reason for people to continue to fight on against the Mujahideen, but it did happen. So in a sense, the U.S. is our defeat today as a nation is more pathetic than what happened in 1989 when the Soviets left Afghanistan, because the Soviets intervened in Afghanistan in order to prop up a communist regime that they had basically, they'd subverted the Afghan government about like 11 or 12 years earlier. So the Afghanis who they were leaving behind were sort of lucky to even be in any position to run the country, and they hung on for another 2 years. In our case, right, so the Afghan government basically fell apart so fast, and that even Biden's target date, which was September 11th, to finally conclude the mission in Afghanistan, it did not happen. He ran out of time a month before he was expecting to. So just to give you an idea of that, a quote-unquote success would have been for the Taliban to seize power maybe a day after September 11th, maybe on September 12th, which would have still been embarrassing, right? But you wouldn't have this this joke, this total sham of a president basically saying, well, I'm not only going to violate the agreement that the previous president, Donald Trump, signed with the Taliban, I'm also going to set a date that is totally symbolic. It has no real relevance to the mission, and then set up the people that I'm leaving behind to try to cover my tracks until that can be accomplished. Well, it didn't work. And I think in maybe one day when people are able to honestly assess what's going on here, because I don't think that the our society is free enough to do that at the moment. People are not allowed to express their opinions on many topics, but one day a more fair accounting will happen, and people will realize that we've had leadership that doesn't care about results. They don't care about actually improving the situation. They don't care about the people of Afghanistan. They don't care about American veterans. They don't care about the price that we have to pay in terms of our soldiers and personnel over there. They don't care about the civilians that lose their lives or have their entire existence upended in the name of nation building. They simply don't care. They all they care about is the narrative that they are doing the best they can as world leaders. Because as world leaders, it's all about some sort of quest, a grand quest for prosperity for all, right? And prosperity for all has to come at the expense of some. And that's what I see here from Nancy Pelosi. She says the president is to be commended for the clarity of purpose of his statement on Afghanistan and his action. The Taliban must know the world is watching its actions. We are concerned about reports regarding the Taliban's brutal treatment of all Afghans, especially women and girls. So she did get ratioed for that comment, which is the only metric that can still exist on Twitter. So this woman, I don't know, she's a Republican candidate. So yes, biased, but still. She says clarity of his purpose of statement. What are you smoking? They don't know what is going on from day to day. And somebody responded, one would expect a military that has been trained for 20 years from a supposed elite force that they would fight back. That's what was expected when American troops pulled out. But the Afghanis did not fight back. You would think they learned nothing in 20 years. And people are saying, 1,178 days until the 2024 election. So the same woman who commented before says, yep, and we'll be able to get more Republicans out of office. I can't wait. So there are people who are out there who are trying to blame the Republican party for this. And it's really disgusting because, first of all, the Democrats, from the get-go, they endorsed the war in Afghanistan under President Bush, who was obviously not a Democrat. And they, every year, so just to be clear, whatever their vocal criticisms were of the way the war was going, the Democrats would consistently vote for the budgets that Republican presidents would put out there. And vice versa, the Republicans, when they were out of office, out of the White House at least, you would see them. They would consistently allocate money for Afghanistan. They would consistently authorize the use of military force in Afghanistan. And there was never any accountability. They would basically trust these experts that were out there, saying that yes, we have an idea of where we're going, and we finally figured it out. And every time it was false. So there's no reason that people should blame the Republican Party specifically for this, or the Democratic Party specifically for this. They both share the blame in a very, a very clear manner. But they instead, they want to point fingers at each other. That's exactly why I think that this notion that Biden coming into office would unite Americans, it's turned out to be such a huge illusion, right? He hasn't really united anyone. In fact, I would say people who continue to have faith in him, they're people who keep their eyes closed. That's the only way to have faith in him, because to judge from his own actions and statements, there's really not much to have any faith in. Somebody commented, Speaker Pelosi, this isn't the time for victory laps. There are thousands of people in Afghanistan who are desperate for help and need to be in the U.S. so that they and their families can survive. Put pressure on Mayorkas and Blinken. We are failing so many people right now. So these are people who are not even conservative. They're not supporters of the Republicans at all, and they're criticizing Pelosi for this. And of course there are people who are Republicans in this in this comment thread who are dunking on her for these withdrawals. People are asking, where is Joe Biden? So that's as far as Pelosi's concerned. Let's look at Chuck Schumer. So you have this guy. So I think that the Republicans, they're always going to saber rattle. You have people like McConnell and the Republican minority leader in the House, McCarthy. They're always going to say, well, we could have done more in Afghanistan. I think they're wrong too. But the irony is that the Democrats were always supposed to be the real anti-war party, but Schumer hasn't even tweeted anything about Afghanistan, right? He's tweeted very little this weekend. Maybe he had some sort of important family affair to attend to or something. Who knows? But it's pretty apparent that these leaders, they don't see themselves as being responsible for this war that they not only authorized, but they've kept funded over and over again for all these years. Every budget you have to allocate, funds for the war effort, and they've never said no. In fact, saying no is to them the equivalent of saying Voldemort, if you want, like or whatever the saying Beetlejuice 3 times. They're afraid. They're afraid of what'll happen if they stop saying yes. So Biden tweeted about Haiti, which, not to diminish it, horrible time for Haiti, but it's natural disaster. Natural disasters, you don't necessarily have a way to prevent it. I mean, you can't foresee an earthquake, right? So with all due respect to the people of Haiti, and God willing, they won't see as many tragedies like this in the future, but it definitely isn't something that is unusual in Haiti. So he tweeted about Haiti. He didn't tweet anything about Afghanistan. Let's see the official POTUS account. So he had a full statement on Haiti, but let's see if he had one on Afghanistan. So this was from August 14th. It says, over the past several days, I've been in close contact with my national security team to give them direction on how to protect our interests and values as we end our military mission in Afghanistan. First, based on the recommendations of our diplomatic, military, and intelligence teams, I have authorized the deployment of approximately 5,000 U.S. troops to make sure we can have an orderly and safe drawdown of U.S. personnel and other allied personnel. Well, too late for that. And an orderly and safe evacuation of Afghans who helped our troops during our mission and those at risk from the Taliban advance. Second, I have ordered our armed forces and our intelligence community to ensure that we will maintain the capability and the vigilance to address future terrorist threats from Afghanistan. Third, I have directed the Secretary of State to support President Ghani and other Afghan leaders as they seek to prevent further bloodshed and pursue a political settlement. Secretary Blinken will also engage with key regional stakeholders. Fourth, we have conveyed to the Taliban representatives in Doha via our combatant commander that any action on their part on the ground in Afghanistan that puts U.S. personnel or our mission at risk there will be met with a swift and strong U.S. military response. Fifth, I have placed Ambassador Tracy Jacobson in charge of a whole-of-government effort to process, transport, and relocate Afghan special immigrant visa applicants and other Afghan allies. Our hearts go out to the brave Afghan men and women who are now at risk. We are working to evacuate thousands of those who helped our cause and their families. That's what we are going to do. Now, let me be clear about how we got to here. America went to Afghanistan 20 years ago to defeat the forces that attacked this country on September 11th. That mission resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden over a decade ago and the degradation of al-Qaeda. And yet, 10 years later, when I became president, a small number of U.S. troops still remain on the ground in harm's way with a looming deadline to withdraw them or go back to open combat. Over our country's 20 years at war in Afghanistan, America has sent its finest young men and women, invested nearly $1 trillion, trained over 300,000 Afghan soldiers and police, equipped them with state-of-the-art military equipment, and maintained their Air Force as part of the longest war in U.S. history. 1 more year or 5 more years of U.S. military presence would not have made a difference if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country. And an endless American presence in the middle of another country's civil conflict was not acceptable. When I came to office, I inherited a deal cut by my predecessor, which he invited the Taliban to discuss at Camp David on the eve of 9/11 of 2019 that left the Taliban in the strongest position militarily since 2001 and imposed a May 1st, 2021 deadline on U.S. forces. Shortly before he left office, he also drew U.S. forces down to a bare minimum of 2,500. Therefore, when I became president, I faced a choice: follow through on the deal with a brief extension to get our forces and our allies' forces out safely, or ramp up our presence and send more American troops to fight once again in another country's civil conflict. I was the fourth president to preside over an American troop presence in Afghanistan. Two Republicans, 2 Democrats. I would not and will not pass this war on to a fifth. I think that statement shows a tremendous amount of self-delusion. Biden, at one point, I think last week, he said that there's 300,000 Afghan troops. So he had a very different tone then. Here we go. So this was, and I like Real Clear Politics. They are very good at finding these clips. Flashback. President Biden said last month the Taliban retaking Afghanistan was not inevitable. So listen to this.
We're ending America's longest war, but we'll always honor the bravery of the American patriots who served in it. May God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you.
Mr. President, do you trust the Taliban, Mr. President?
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well equipped as any army in the world, and an Air Force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
So he was saying the exact opposite last month of what he said here, where he said that they trained over 300,000 Afghan soldiers, and if they can't, if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country, then 1 or 5 more years of presence wouldn't make a difference. So his whole argument here, if this isn't an argument, it's a statement, but the statement itself shows the fallacious nature of the administration's thinking, whether it's Biden who's thinking this or not. It's delusional enough that you could believe that it's Joe Biden, because on the one hand, he said that having another year or 5 years would not make a difference. But on the other hand, he was saying that he couldn't meet Trump's deadline of May to withdraw all the troops. So he extended it a few months. Well, what difference did it make? I'll tell you what difference it made. It actually did make a difference. If the U.S. would have withdrawn the troops on time in May and directed the Afghans and at least given them full combat support at the time up to withdrawal, the Afghan government would have at least held territory a little longer and maybe found a way to reorganize itself. As it stood, what happened was that the terms of the agreement were accepted by both the Afghan government and the U.S. and its allies, as well as the Taliban and tribal leaders. Once Biden moved the deadline for the withdrawal, the Taliban and the tribal leaders had no reason to trust in the validity of the agreement, of the honorability of the agreement in the eyes of the Americans, and they basically said, "Well, okay, so you're not going to withdraw in time. We're going to make sure that we grab as much territory as we can before you leave, so that once you leave, we're ready to pounce and take over." Well, as it turned out, that Taliban were in tremendous luck because not only did Biden bungle the withdrawal, he also allowed first of all, he started to withdraw the troops, but in many cases he would withdraw them without telling the Afghan army. So that there's even a famous case, I think it was with Bagram Air Base, where the Afghans woke up one morning and suddenly the Americans weren't even there. Now that's a little hard to believe because if the operations are integrated, they would at least hear them leave, right? You would think that they would be able to hear them in the night. People are moving and things like that. But that's at least the way that the story was presented from media reports. So apparently the Afghans were caught unprepared by certain American withdrawals from various areas. And at the same time, the Taliban are making all of these gains, and they're also advancing and committing more terror attacks, such that really you're seeing these Afghans decide that, look, the Americans have decided that they're going to leave us high and dry. The Taliban is definitely not going to be playing, cutesy with us anymore. They don't need to negotiate with us anymore because there are no Americans behind us. And also the tribal leaders have no reason to trust in the Afghan government anymore because they have no leverage, right? All they have are the cities and the administrative government and the bureaus and whatever. They don't have the countryside. They don't have the actual resources of Afghanistan in their hand. So there's nothing for them to gain in sticking their necks out for the Afghan government. So the tribal leaders started to yield to the Taliban, or even in some cases join in and help them. And many of the Afghan soldiers and police started to either make their way overseas to places like Iran and Turkmenistan and other border countries, or defect to the Taliban or desert. So that's the story of what happened. If the withdrawal would have happened earlier, it's possible that it wouldn't have been as chaotic and disorganized, because there would have been less time for this to happen. But yeah, it's possible that Trump could have made a mistake, so to speak. But Trump's goal the entire time had been to withdraw the U.S. from Afghanistan. He'd wanted to do it much earlier. I believe he wanted to do it in late 2020. And the military and the Defense Department and the Pentagon were basically stonewalling him and lying to him about the effect of it. And remember, there was the whole Bounty Gate regarding the so-called Russian payments to the Afghans. By the way, there's actual, or sorry, to the Taliban. There's actual rumors going out. I don't know what the substance is behind them, but that Biden paid the Taliban not to harm U.S. troops before they could fully withdraw. So everything that is going on right now, it's largely the result of carelessness and the lack of personal responsibility among these people who are at the top. Apparently, so top Biden spokeswoman Jen Psaki is out of office as Afghanistan falls to the Taliban. So not only is it impossible to reach the president himself, not even his main spokesperson is available. So It says here, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki will have to circle back with reporters asking about the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. An email query from the Washington Examiner sent Sunday evening to President Joe Biden's top spokesperson prompted an automatic reply from Psaki's account that said she will, quote, will be out of the office Sunday through next weekend. So it's not even, it's the whole week. So the request for comment includes questions about when Biden plans to address the situation in Afghanistan and take questions from the media. The automatic response did include information about reaching other members of the press shop for comment. The Washington Examiner reached out to them as well. Still, the automatic email reply from Biden's leading connection in the media, first reported by Fox News, is sure to add to the firestorm centered on Biden's relative absence as the U.S.-backed Afghan government fails. Biden has been at Camp David in Maryland, where he has been receiving updates from top U.S. officials, but is also not accessible to reporters. His absence has prompted criticism from Republicans. So, for example, where is Joe Biden, says Representative Jim Banks, a naval reservist who deployed to Afghanistan in 2014. So, yada, yada, yada. You also have Liz Cheney, who's a moron, saying that Biden and Trump bear responsibility on Afghanistan. Well, how about your dad? How about Dick Cheney? Does he have any responsibility for it? I mean, he got us into Afghanistan, so the people who got us out of Afghanistan, which I agree, it's a failure on Biden's part at least. That you could argue that Trump had a hand in it too, perhaps, but. The person who got us into Afghanistan certainly bears responsibility, Dick Cheney. So that's one thing. Jake Tapper apparently also grilled Antony Blinken, the loser who is the Secretary of State, about it. And he asked him how Joe Biden got this so wrong. Well, Joe Biden, how does he not get anything wrong? Have you listened to him recently? So that's about it for today. I didn't want to go too long on this, and I actually went longer than I intended. Tragic day for everyone involved, unless you are the Taliban. But please like, share, and subscribe. You can find me on BitChute, Rumble, and Odyssey for video hosting. It's a difficult time to go through. Those of you that grew up in my generation, you remember going into, you remember America going to Afghanistan. I personally, I did not serve there, but we have many veterans who were maimed and they've lost friends and family there, or their fighting family, you could say. So if you know any, please reach out to them. Tell them that, it's hard to find meaning in tragedies like this, like spending so much time on something so difficult and then seeing it go up in flames like this can't be easy. But yeah, please continue to follow. Newsletter is coming out. BitChute, Rumble, and Odyssey. You can also find me on Gab and Minds, and I will talk to you later.